Old Tucson Studios, Arizona, August 1958. The temperature is 114 degrees, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like water and turns the desert into a frying pan. John Wayne and Dean Martin are filming Rio Bravo, the western that would become a classic. They're 3 weeks into production, and the desert is trying to kill everyone. On this particular day, they're shooting a chase sequence. Duke is on horseback, galloping through a narrow canyon, cameras rolling, dust flying everywhere. And then the horse stumbles. Duke goes down hard, 230 pounds of American legend hitting the rocky desert floor at full speed. His boot catches in the stirrup. The horse panics, starts dragging him across the jagged terrain. Crew members freeze. The director yells cut, but nobody moves. They're too far away, too shocked, too slow. Except Dean Martin. Dean doesn't think. He doesn't hesitate. He sprints toward the runaway horse, grabs the reins, and yanks the animal to a stop. Then he drops to his knees next to Duke, who's lying motionless in the dirt, blood pooling under his head. Duke, talk to me. John Wayne opens his eyes, looks up at Dean Martin, and says, "What took you so long?" To understand what Dean Martin did that day, you need to understand who John Wayne was in 1958. John Wayne wasn't just an actor. He was America. He was the symbol of everything the country wanted to believe about itself. Tough, honest, brave, unbreakable. By 1958, Duke had made over 100 films. He was the biggest box office draw in Hollywood history. When John Wayne walked onto a set, everyone, directors, producers, co-stars, deferred to him. He was the king. But Dean Martin? Dean was still proving himself. Sure, he'd been a star with Jerry Lewis. Sure, he'd had hit records and successful nightclub acts. But in Hollywood's eyes, Dean Martin was a singer who dabbled in acting. A nightclub entertainer playing cowboy. Nobody expected much from him. Rio Bravo was supposed to be John Wayne's movie. Dean was there as supporting cast, playing a drunk named Dude who was trying to get sober. Most people figured Dean would show up, hit his marks, collect his check, and go home. John Wayne thought differently. From the first day of filming, Duke saw something in Dean that others missed. He saw a professional. He saw a man who knew his lines, showed up on time, and never complained about the brutal conditions. Dean Martin is the most underrated actor in Hollywood. Wayne told director Howard Hawks during the second week of shooting, "Everyone thinks he's just a crooner. They're wrong. The man can act." But it wasn't Dean's acting that would cement their friendship forever. It was what happened in that canyon on August 14, 1958. The morning started, like any other, 5 a.m. call time. The cast and crew assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to get the outdoor shots done before the Arizona sun turned the desert into an oven. The scene was simple. Sheriff John T. Chance, played by Wayne, chases a suspect through a narrow canyon on horseback. Standard Western stuff. Duke had done similar scenes hundreds of times. The horse they gave him was a chestnut mare named Bonnie. Good temperament, experienced with film work. The Wranglers had used her on a dozen productions without incident, but nobody knew that Bonnie had stepped on a rattlesnake nest the day before. The snake had struck her left rear leg. The wound was small, almost invisible. The Wranglers hadn't noticed it during the morning check. The venom was working its way through Bonnie's system, making her increasingly agitated, unpredictable. Dean Martin was watching from the sidelines as Duke mounted up. Something felt off. Dean couldn't explain it, but the horse seemed nervous, twitchy, not the calm professional animal he'd seen in rehearsals. "Hey Duke," Dean called out. "That horse looks a little spooked. You sure she's okay?" Wayne laughed it off. "She's fine, Dean. Probably just doesn't like the heat. Hell, neither do I." The assistant director called for quiet. Cameras rolled. Howard Hawks yelled action. Duke spurred Bonnie into a gallop, heading into the canyon. For the first 50 yards, everything was perfect. The cameras captured exactly what they needed. John Wayne, heroic and unstoppable, thundering through the desert. Then Bonnie's left rear leg buckled. The venom had weakened the muscle. The leg simply gave out mid-stride. Bonnie went down hard, tumbling forward, throwing Duke from the saddle. But Duke's right boot caught in the stirrup. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. But for everyone who witnessed it, time seemed to stop. Duke hit the ground shoulder first. His head bounced off a rock. Bonnie, panicked and in pain, scrambled to her feet and started running, dragging Duke behind her. The terrain was brutal. Jagged rocks, cactus, hard-packed desert floor. Every foot Bonnie dragged him was tearing Duke apart. "Stop the horse," Howard Hawks screamed. But nobody could. The wranglers were 100 yards away. The crew was behind the cameras. There was no one close enough to help, except Dean Martin. Dean had been standing about 40 feet from the canyon entrance, watching the shot. The moment Bonnie went down, he started running. He didn't think about what he was doing. He didn't calculate the risk. He just ran. A panicked horse is one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. 1,000 pounds of muscle and fear, hooves flying in every direction. Getting close to a runaway horse is a good way to get your skull caved in. Dean didn't care. He sprinted at an angle, cutting across the horse's path. Bonnie saw him coming and tried to veer away, but Dean was faster. He launched himself at the horse's head, grabbing the reins with both hands, digging his boots into the dirt. Bonnie reared up. Her front hooves came within inches of Dean's face. But he held on, pulling down with everything he had, using his body weight to force the horse's head toward the ground. Whoa, whoa, girl. Easy. For 3 eternal seconds. It was a battle of wills. Dean Martin versus 1,000 pounds of terrified horse. His arms screamed. His shoulders felt like they were being ripped from their sockets. But he didn't let go. Finally, Bonnie stopped. She stood there, trembling, foam dripping from her mouth. And Dean Martin stood there too. His hands still wrapped around the reins, his chest heaving, his shirt soaked with sweat. Then he looked down at John Wayne. Duke was lying motionless in the dirt. His right leg was still caught in the stirrup, twisted at an ugly angle. Blood was running down his face from a gash on his forehead. His eyes were closed. Dean dropped to his knees beside him. "Duke. Duke, can you hear me?" "Nothing." "Medic. We need a medic here now." Dean carefully freed Duke's boot from the stirrup. He cradled Duke's head in his hands, keeping it elevated, remembering something he'd learned during the war about head injuries. "Come on, Duke. Open your eyes. Talk to me." For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The crew was running toward them. Howard Hawks was shouting orders. Someone was calling for an ambulance. And then John Wayne's eyes opened. He looked up at Dean Martin, blood running down his face, dirt caked in his hair, and he smiled. "What took you so long?" Dean let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Jesus, Duke, you scared the hell out of me." "Yeah, well, you scared the hell out of that horse." The medic arrived and started examining Duke's injuries. Miraculously, nothing was broken. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp wounds bleed heavily, but often aren't serious. His shoulder was badly bruised, his right ankle sprained, and he had cuts and scrapes all over his body. But he was alive. "You're one lucky son of a bitch," the medic said. Duke looked at Dean, still kneeling there in the dirt, hands shaking from the adrenaline. Luck had nothing to do with it. Production shut down for 2 days while Duke recovered. The studio wanted to bring in a stunt double for the remaining horse scenes. Duke refused. "I've been falling off horses for 30 years, he told the producers. "I'm not stopping now." But something had changed between Duke and Dean, something that couldn't be captured on film. On the second night of the shutdown, Duke invited Dean to his trailer for dinner. Just the two of them, sitting in the cramped space, eating steaks and drinking bourbon. For a long time, neither man spoke. They just sat there, comfortable in the silence, the way old friends do. Finally, Duke broke the silence. "You know, I've been making movies since before you were born, Dean. I've worked with hundreds of actors, thousands of crew members." Dean waited. "In all that time, you know how many of them have put themselves in danger for me." "How many?" "One." Duke looked at Dean. "You." Dean shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Anyone would have done it." "No, they wouldn't have." "I saw their faces, Dean. The crew, the wranglers, everyone. They froze. They stood there watching me get dragged across the desert, and they didn't move. They were far away. They couldn't. You were far away too. You just didn't let that stop you." Duke poured them both another bourbon. "You grabbed a panicked horse by the reins, Dean. 1,000 pounds of terrified animal with hooves that could have killed you, and you didn't hesitate. Why?" Dean thought about it for a moment. "I don't know. I saw you going down, and I just ran. I didn't think about it. That's what makes it real, Duke said quietly. You didn't think, you just acted. That's not something you can fake, that's who you are. They clinked glasses. I owe you my life, Dean. That's not something I say lightly, and it's not something I'll forget. You don't owe me anything, Duke. You'd have done the same for me. Damn right I would. But that doesn't change what happened. You saved my life. And from now on, as far as I'm concerned, your family. The story of what Dean Martin did in that canyon spread through Hollywood like wildfire. But not because Dean talked about it. He never mentioned it to anyone. When reporters asked about the incident, he downplayed it. Duke's horse got spooked. I helped calm it down, that's all. It was John Wayne who told the story. Again and again, to anyone who would listen. Dean Martin saved my life, Duke would say. And he acts like it was nothing, like anyone would have done it. But they wouldn't have. I know because I was there. I saw everyone else standing around with their mouths open while Dean came running. Howard Hawks, the director, remembered the incident clearly. I've been making films for 40 years, Hawks said in a 1974 interview. I've seen a lot of things on sets. Accidents, injuries, close calls. But I've never seen anything like what Dean did that day. He moved faster than I thought any human could move. And he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about Duke. That's not acting, that's character. The stunt coordinator, a man named Chuck Roberson who had worked with Wayne for decades, was even more direct. Dean Martin is the bravest man I ever saw on a film set, and I've seen a lot of brave men. What he did with that horse grabbing a panicked animal like that, most people would have been killed. Dean wasn't even scared. He was just focused. Like the only thing that mattered was saving Duke. Rio Bravo wrapped production in September 1958. It was released the following year to massive success, cementing Dean Martin's reputation as a serious actor. But for Duke and Dean, the movie was secondary. What mattered was the bond they'd formed. For the next 20 years, they were inseparable. They made 4 more films together: The Sons of Katie Elder, The War Wagon, Bandolero, and Something Big. They played golf together, had dinner together, vacationed together. They were brothers. Duke and Dean had a connection I never saw with anyone else. Maureen O'Hara, Wayne's frequent co-star, remembered. They could communicate without words. They trusted each other completely. And it all started with that day in the canyon. When John Wayne was diagnosed with cancer in 1964, Dean was one of the first people he told. When Duke had his lung removed, Dean visited him in the hospital every single day. Dean would just sit there. Duke's son Patrick remembered. He wouldn't say much. He'd just sit there, keeping my father company. Sometimes they'd play cards. Sometimes they'd watch TV. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence. But Dean was always there. That's what friendship looks like. In June 1979, John Wayne was dying. The cancer had returned. It was everywhere now. His stomach, his intestines, his lymph nodes. The Duke was 72 years old, and his body was finally giving out. Everyone who visited Duke in those final weeks treated him like glass. They spoke in hushed tones. They had tears in their eyes. They acted like he was already gone. It drove Duke crazy. They look at me like I'm a ghost, he complained to his daughter Asay. Like I'm already dead. I'm not dead yet. I'm right here. Then Dean Martin came to visit. Dean walked into Duke's bedroom, took one look at his friend, gaunt, frail, barely 140 pounds, and said, "Jesus, Duke, you look like hell. What happened? You stop eating beef?" Duke stared at Dean for a long moment. Then he started laughing. Real laughing. The first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "Screw you, Dean. I could still kick your ass." "With what? Those toothpick legs? I've seen stronger sticks holding up tomato plants." For the next 2 hours they sat together, trading insults, telling stories, laughing about the old days. Dean didn't treat Duke like a dying man. He treated him like his friend. Before Dean left, Duke grabbed his hand. "Thank you, Dean." "For what?" "For treating me like me. Everyone else looks at me like I'm already in the coffin. But you're still busting my balls. Just like always." Dean smiled. "That's what friends are for, Duke. You saved my life twice, you know." "What do you mean?" "Once in that canyon, when I was being dragged by that horse, and today when you reminded me I'm still alive. Dean squeezed Duke's hand. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. "I love you, Dean. You know that, right?" "I know, Duke. I love you too." John Wayne died on June 11, 1979. Dean Martin was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. Years later, when Dean was asked about his friendship with John Wayne, he was typically modest. "Duke was a great man. The greatest I ever knew. I was just lucky to be his friend." But when pressed about the canyon incident, about saving Duke's life, Dean would always change the subject. "People make too much of it," he'd say. "Duke's horse got spooked. I helped. End of story." Patrick Wayne, Duke's son, offered a different perspective. "My father talked about that day all the time. He said Dean was the bravest man he ever met. Not because Dean wasn't scared, he probably was, but because he acted anyway. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about himself. He just ran toward danger because his friend needed help." My father never forgot that. Never. That's the Dean Martin story that should be told. Not the smooth singer with the martini glass. Not the Rat Pack joker with the easy smile. The man who sprinted toward a panicked horse because his friend was in trouble. The man who grabbed 1,000 pounds of terrified animal by the reins and wouldn't let go. The man who saved John Wayne's life and then spent the next 20 years pretending it was nothing. Because that's what real heroes do. They don't brag. They don't seek glory. They don't even think of themselves as heroes. They just act when action is needed, and then they move on. Dean Martin wasn't just the king of cool. He was the kind of man who runs toward danger when everyone else freezes. And John Wayne, the symbol of American heroism, knew exactly what that meant. "Dean Martin saved my life," Duke said in one of his final interviews, "and he never let me thank him properly. Every time I tried, he'd make a joke or change the subject. That's Dean. That's who he really is. Not a performer, not an entertainer. A man, the best man I ever knew." If this story about true friendship moved you, subscribe and hit that thumbs up. Share with someone who's ever had a friend who'd run toward danger for them. Have you ever risked something for someone you loved? Let us know in the comments. Ring that notification bell for more untold stories about Dean Martin's legacy.